Welcome to week 4. I think by now you have probably gathered some of my pedagogical method in this course. Purposefully each week I have you engaging the text, engaging some secondary writers of various backgrounds before you get to Response Forum 2 and listen to some kind of interpretation of mine. Somewhat more developed in these podcast expositions. And I'm doing that because I really do want you to begin to struggle with the text, to form, at least tentatively, your own interpretive judgments before you hear some kind of developed interpretation of mine. Because if you don't do that, the tendency will often be simply to kind of hear the meaning of the text only as I present it, and to have difficulty seeing alternatives or developing your own alternatives without my voice kind of cramming things out. So I want you to be able each week to engage the text yourself with some secondary voices that you're dialoguing with, and then bring those somewhat formed interpretive judgments to your listening or otherwise digesting an interpretation of the letters segment that we're reading of mine. And I hope what that does is enable you to perhaps recognize details that you had missed, nuances that you had glossed over, perhaps hear the rhetorical force or flow of the argument somewhat differently than you had when studying it yourself. And then, of course, to enable you to be able to feel some dissonance between how I'm interpreting the text and how you have, or what you hear, and to be able to express that, whether it's a clear disagreement between us, which is welcome, or a question where something just doesn't quite line up. That's kind of what I'm hoping this order of study helps to promote, is sort of a process for you where you're able to see the development of your own interpretation from your initial sort of passes through the text, through hearing what I've got to say and engaging in some of the issues that my interpretation will call your attention to. I have to say I'm pleasantly surprised so far in the class, because I was worried, having never taught this class before online, that sort of listening to an audio of me trying to interpret the argument of a letter like Romans would be just too difficult to follow, because the argument is very dense. There's a lot of subtlety to it, and I was just imagining that it was going to be hard for people to track with what I would try to communicate in these sort of podcasts that I'm doing, marching through different segments of the letter in sequence. But I'm pleasantly surprised, as I say, because I'm reading your responses in the second forum each week, and I'm finding that you've tracked with what I've had to say very well, and it's coming through clearly enough not only for you to understand, but often also to be able to disagree or to ask pointed questions that seek clarification or qualification. So thanks for that careful engagement with that part of our material, and I will keep those coming so that hopefully you have a chance at kind of hearing the flow of the text tied together in a particular way. Often, as you've probably experienced, maybe at Fuller, but in other places and commentaries, our approach to interpretation can leave the text kind of sitting in fragments. And there's some purpose to that, breaking down the text into pieces and analyzing it, debating about it. The problem is then you sometimes emerge from the study of Scripture without having formed a very clear sense of what it has to say. And so my hope is that by finishing our study each week with a consideration of a somewhat sustained interpretation of what we've been studying, you get at least one take, mine, on what that segment of the letter has to say. So, just a little background on the approach that we're taking and what I hope it's enabling you to do in your own process of study each week. This week we are going to try something a little bit different. I have tried this in one online class before and it went pretty well, so I want to pursue it again, and that is giving you the opportunity to participate in a video conference with me and 4 or 5 or so other students of a group. So what that means is the groups for our discussions this week are opt-in, meaning you have to sign up for the group that you're going to be joining for the week, and there is an instructional video that guides you in how to do that, and of course you can contact me if you're having any problems. But one, or actually in this case 2 of those groups are video conference groups where the name of the group is the time of the video conference. And what that enables you to do is to determine quickly by looking at the names of the groups whether there's a video conference time that works for you. And if there is, then you can join that group if a video conference is something that you want to try. No pressure, of course, to do that. If you prefer to do your work much as we have been doing thus far in writing, that's perfectly fine. But if you want to try a video conference, then I would love to do that. I found that kind of conversation to be generative for all of us. By the way, since a goodly number of the students in the class live in the area of Pasadena, you're also welcome to actually come to Fuller Pasadena at the time of the video conference, if that's the group that you join, and simply join me in person in a room where we'll have whoever is signing on to that video conference present on the screen. So that's also an option. So you'll see that in the work for week 4, the summary of that, instructions on how to do that, and we'll see how it goes this week. You'll also notice that for Response Forum 2, I have given you a couple of options for how you might respond. One would be much as you have thus far, which I think is working quite well, so we can keep doing that, and that is a written response. In this case, for this week, 300 words or so. But if you prefer to record a video response of 3 to 5 minutes, that is also welcome. And I just ask that it be a video response that you've thought through some, so that there's some substance to it as you react to the podcast and raise any other issues that you'd like to for discussion in that second response forum for the week. So look for that. Then you'll notice in this week's material that I'm beginning to give you some information about your first formal assignment in this class, which is an interpretive working paper on a particular passage in Romans that you can choose from a list that is given to you in the syllabus. And the instructions on that assignment are available in this week's material, an assignment guide. There's also some samples. We're still a couple weeks away from when you will submit your first draft of that assignment for peer review. And of course, I'll explain that when we get closer to it. But I just wanted to give you an opportunity at about this stage in the course to start thinking about that working paper. Maybe select the passage that you're going to study, start thinking through how you might analyze your passage in a paper following the guide that I've given you, and then of course perhaps ask questions of clarification or concern that you have as you begin looking toward what sort of paper you want to write. So look for that material and just begin thinking through that assignment, making sure you've got a clear sense of what it requires of you. I think by this point in the course, you'll find as you read the assignment guide that the weekly discussions, the prompts, the kinds of interpretive questions that I have been putting to you have been preparing you, developing your skill in the interpretation of Romans, so that by the time you sit down to write this paper, you feel like you've got a sense of how to go about it and to carry out an analysis of the passage that is going to be adequately probing, sensitive to concerns like the rhetorical purpose of the particular passage that you're studying in the flow of the letter, issues like that. So the kinds of questions that you've been addressing in the response forums, especially the first one each week that deal with particular interpretive issues, those are the kinds of questions that you'll be formulating and then taking up yourself in this interpretive working paper of your own. We've got a great segment of the letter coming up this week, some great passages. We'll be thinking a lot about Abraham and how to make sense of our relationship to Abraham in the Messiah. And that is a question of how to tell the story of God's revelation, how to tell the story of the formation of the people of God over generations, how to account for the sort of dynamics of that diverse community across time and space, and of course to make sense of our place in it today and what that says to us about the kind of life that we're called to live together. So I think there's some really good stimulus for our discussions, and it's going to give way directly then to understanding justification, understanding our inheritance, our ability to participate in manifold ways in this promised family of Abraham, in terms that now allow, Paul says, encourage a certain kind of boasting. And this is counterintuitive for us as readers in some ways, as you'll see me call your attention to in the first response forum, because everything to this point in the letter has been about discouraging boasting, and yet here Paul is going to now advocate a certain kind of boasting. So I look forward to your sort of sharing what you have to say about how to interpret that. I think it reveals that Paul is something of a craftsman when it comes to the rhetorical development of this letter. The letter is full of subtlety, full of fine distinctions, and often we flatten it out because we want to turn it into a sort of neat theological treatise or something. But as I hope this example of this sort of telling shift when it comes to boasting indicates, there is a kind of poetic subtlety to Paul's argument, a kind of artistry with words that we want to pay attention to in the course of interpreting the letter, and to allow it not simply to give us puzzles, but to affect, to influence our own speech, and therefore the life that we live as influenced by our speech. So do try to give that sort of craftsmanship of this letter its due in your interpretation, and I look forward to what you come up with, your questions, and the wide-ranging discussions that